I think we'll get underway. Can everybody hear clearly? Good. Well, we seem to have quite a few new faces here, so I should introduce myself at the outset. Peter Baldwin, I chair the Blackheath Philosophy Forum, and I share with our speaker today the dubious honour of having spent quite a few years in the Federal House of Representatives, albeit I was on the opposite side of the chamber. And so, Mr. Howard, in case any of you have just recently arrived migrated from Iceland, perhaps, you have the old cliche, a speaker who needs no introduction. Well, if that applies to any speaker, it's our speaker today, but just for the Icelandics, I'll just run quickly through summarise Mr. Howard's political career. He was the Prime Minister of Australia from 1996 to 2007 and very cruelly deposed me and various other Labor ministers at the time. And he was the member for Bennelong from 1974 to 2007, at which point he was very cruelly deposed by somebody or other in his seat. But that seems to be the way with politics. And second longest serving Prime Minister of this country after Sir Robert Menzies. And he had two stints as leader of the Liberal Party from 85 to 89 and then from 95 to 2007. So that's a pretty extraordinary record. And while I was on the opposite side of the political divide in the federal parliament, I'd have to join with my old colleague Kim Beazley, who described John Howard as the most formidable conservative politician of his generation. And having been on the receiving end of a question time grilling from Mr. Howard, I can only endorse that viewpoint. Now, so I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. John Howard, for taking the time out to come to our little philosophy forum up in the mountains. Thanks very much and welcome to Blackheath. Today's talk, which I assume you've all seen, the topic, it's forum number 9 in a series under the broad heading Politics and the Future of Civilization. So what we were trying to do was look at a number of political issues, but to take a very long-term perspective, to look at the civilizational implications of some of the developments that are now taking place. And we actually started off by looking at some profound technological changes, such as the rise of artificial intelligence and the development of quantum computation, which I think is generally accepted will have very profound effects on human civilization generally. So we kind of started on that note, but we've been addressing the problem from a variety of different perspectives, and we've covered a number of different approaches to it, and we've straddled the ideological spectrum as well. If you came to the one we held last weekend, Professor John Keane, who's very much a person of the left, so we had that perspective. So we try to keep a reasonable ideological balance. Now, what the issue today goes to it has to be considered in the context of the tectonic changes that are going on in the world at the moment. Things like the re-emergence of autocratic great powers, Russia and China, and the change in the balance of forces in the world. That's one profound change. You have the rise of political Islam. You have the rise, in other words, you've got the rise of powerful, assertive cultures and nation states that are posing a significant challenge to the liberal democratic order that we've gotten used to in the West, Western civilization, to use that highly contested term. And there's been a lot of discussion about the idea that those of us within Western civilization have tended to adopt an overly critical attitude towards it, and to that inheritance that we have, which derives from various sources, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the classical tradition of Greece and Rome, together with the transformation brought about by the Enlightenment. Those three elements are normally referred to when we talk about Western civilization. So are our schools, are our universities leading to us making people sufficiently appreciative of the positive sides of that, which are very considerable, or are they overly obsessed with finding fault and not finding fault with some of the rival cultures and civilizations that we deal with at the moment? So that's the claim that's made, and that underpins the argument for example, the proposal to have a special centre for the study of Western civilization based in an Australian university, the so-called Ramsay proposal. Now, no doubt there'll be a lot of discussion about that today. So if you accept that there is a problem of an undervaluation of our civilizational heritage, is it the right way to address it, to set up an institute such as is being proposed by Ramsay? This is a debate which has gone significantly further, has a longer history in the United States, where the major universities there, or the so-called Ivy League universities, have in the past often had a core curriculum based on looking at the so-called Western canon, you know, the great books in philosophy, literature, history, etc. And progressively over the last few decades, those core curricula have been essentially eliminated, with demonstrations with students at Stanford and other such places saying, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ has got to go, and so forth. And, but a number of people have argued in the US context, where there's actually a lot more data, that what we've seen in recent times is the emergence of a kind of ideological monoculture, at least within the social sciences and the humanities, within the universities. There's a group, who call themselves the Heterodox Academy, that now has about 1,500 tenured academics affiliated to it in the United States, that have been making precisely that case, and that there's a desperate need to inject a good deal more viewpoint diversity into higher education. And they cite in evidence, and all the key founders of this group are self-described, none of them are self-described conservatives, and they're all somehow liberal in the American sense. But they all accept that there is a problem if there's a complete hegemony of a particular ideological perspective, and their goal is to try and do something about that. So it's a global debate that I think needs to be seriously discussed, and we certainly welcome the opportunity to do that today. So I'll just outline how we plan to proceed. Mr. Howard's going to talk significantly shorter than our normal introductory lecture at these forums, and after he's concluded, we've got a couple of respondents who are going to respond to what he has to say, coming at it from somewhat different perspectives. I won't say any more about the respondents at the moment. I'll introduce them when we get to that part of it. So that's basically, then we, if you haven't been here before, we then break for a short time to allow people to consume cakes and coffee and tea and so forth, and then we go to question and answer from the floor. So that's the plan, and with that I'll ask Mr. Howard to address us.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can everybody hear? Well, first of all, can I thank Peter very warmly for the introduction. It is true that for a lengthy period of time we weren't armed combatants, we were ideological combatants. Peter was a person who profoundly disagreed with my take on many things, but he always did it in an intellectual and very respectful fashion. And some of the contributions, he may be surprised to hear me say this, but some of the contributions that both he and Brian Howe made from the Labor Party side in relation to the formation of social policy were contributions that I very greatly respected. I'm impressed at the commitment of people to studying the political and intellectual and philosophical eddies of modern society that such large numbers should turn out here in beautiful Blackheath on a Saturday afternoon in a sparkling July winter's day. And I am very greatly encouraged because although I am long since out of professional politics, I retain an intense interest in the political debate that continues to rage around the world. And as a wise person once said, context is everything. And what I will say in a moment about the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization, of which I am chairman, has to be put very much in the context of the way in which politics in Australia and politics around the world is being shaken loose from many of the moorings that we had taken for granted for a long period of time. There's little doubt that over the past few years things have happened in politics that nobody thought would ever happen. I don't think I would have imagined that I would see rather, the phenomenon of two first-term Prime Ministers being removed from office long before they had completed their first terms, particularly as both of them had won office with very convincing majorities. I am aware that Mr. Rudd had a big majority when he won, and I am aware that Tony Abbott had a big majority when he won. And yet both of them were removed within very short order. Now, it's not within the remit of this discussion to debate the respective reasons why that occurred, but they are symptomatic of the fact that politics now is more volatile and far less stable than used to be the case. The election of Donald Trump astonished people. I didn't expect Donald Trump to win. I would have agonised if I'd been an American as to who to vote for. My natural disposition would have been to support a Republican candidate, but I publicly expressed reservations about him being elected, and his term in office has been characterised by an unrelenting level of hostility to him from those who felt that the American electorate delivered the wrong outcome. And in Britain, of course, the outcome of the Brexit referendum surprised many people. I was an unapologetic, unrepentant supporter of the decision that the British people took. If I had been British, I'd have voted to leave. Part of my attitude to the European Union is conditioned by the fact that the European Union has never been a friend of our country when it comes to trading policies. One of the very first ministerial jobs that I had in the Fraser government was to be Minister for Special Trade Negotiations, trying to get a better trade deal for Australia, and I watched what I regarded as the hypocrisy and the double standards of all European governments when it came to fair treatment of the highly efficient farmers of Australia and New Zealand. So I was no lover of the EU, but on top of that, I thought the international bureaucracy produced by the European Union was a negation of many of the democratic principles that we have come to know. We have seen, as Peter alluded to, the emergence of this new breed of strong, superficially but not very deeply democratic leaders. The most recent, of course, is Erdogan from Turkey, who's converted Turkey from a country that had many admirers around the Western world and the world generally to a country now which is very, very dictatorial with its governance. We have the sort of under-the-breath expressions of admiration for him and for people like Vladimir Putin, similar but different in a sense from the admiration that was expressed, I think, very legitimately of the late Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, who most people, including myself, would regard as one of the standout statesmen of our region of the world over the last 40 or 50 years. But it is a phenomenon. And all of these things, of course, ask the question, what has happened? What has changed? I suppose one of the answers is that nothing has changed in the sense that if you take a long sweep view of history, it does go through periods when a more autocratic approach is regarded as delivering more efficient outcomes, and under the breath people who embrace democracy will say, oh, well, of course, what we really need for a short period of time is a dose of such and such a rule to get things, to clear away all the backlog and get everything fixed. You've no doubt heard that sort of utterance on many occasions. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that we are still living in the long shadow. History is full of long shadows, and I've just finished reading a couple of books by David Reynolds, the Cambridge historian, about the long shadow of World War I, and also the not so long shadow, because it's not as many years ago, of World War II. And I think the long shadow that we're living under at the moment is the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the old East-West divide. Far more than I think we imagined at the time, domestic politics in the liberal democracies was defined to some degree by the old East-West divide. There was still, in a very general sense, a belief that somehow or other there were two models on display. One was the capitalist West, nominally led by the United States. The other was the command economy approach, led by the Soviet Union. And that did defined Australian politics. The great split in the Australian Labor Party, which cast a very long shadow over Australian politics from the mid-1950s onwards, was in no small measure a product of differing views on communism, differing views on the command economy model approach, or the alternative, more capitalistic model. Now, I think the working through of that has meant that political parties over a period of time, instead of defining themselves overwhelmingly in terms of where they fell in relation to the great economic debate, which is defined by the division between East and West, I think as time has gone by, other issues have replaced them. The decades-long greater emphasis on environmental issues. The more recent rise, and I think it's very pernicious in many respects, the rise of identity politics. I think identity politics played a major role in Hillary Clinton's defeat. I think if she had relied less heavily on identity politics and more heavily on a more orthodox approach from the Democratic Party, she may have been more successful. So, different issues are defining the attitudes taken by political parties. And part of this, as Peter alluded to, is the civilizational issue. The issue of what our society generically stands for, and the wholly reasonable proposition that you can't answer that question without having a better understanding of where we came from. I am, as many of you know, the chairman of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. Let me tell you, I hope fairly precisely, what the remit of that centre is. Paul Ramsay was a highly successful Australian entrepreneur. He established over a lifetime of entrepreneurial success a very large private health insurance, private hospital business. He was very successful. He was very generous and very philanthropic. And he formed the view before he died that he would like the income from a very large bequest that he left. I'm not in a position to say how big it is because I don't know, because I'm the chairman of the centre, I'm not the chairman of the foundation, which controls the investments of Mr. Ramsay's bequest. But he was of the view that although we studied and talked about and were instructed in various elements of our civilization, that over time, for whatever combination of reasons, we had lost an aggregate understanding of the way in which Western civilization had shaped the modern Australia. In other words, he wanted it to be studied from, to use that very ugly term, a more holistic sense than it has been in the past. Now, Paul didn't come at this from any kind of lofty, ambivalent, indifferent, disinterested perspective. He was very much for Western civilization. He didn't leave this bequest in the mind that he was neutral on it. He wasn't neutral on it. He believed very strongly that the various elements of Western civilization, flawed though that civilization has been, like all civilizations have been, he wanted Australians in the future to have a better understanding in an aggregate, holistic sense. So therefore he established the bequest, and the income from the bequest is to fund the pursuit of that more holistic study of Western civilization. And it was made very clear that the first goal was to establish in partnership with what I might loosely call a sandstone university in Australia, a degree in Western civilization. A degree that would examine the impact of Western civilization, but also a degree that would, in the course of that, naturally with proper academic inquiry, recognise the flaws and the shortcomings and the failures of Western civilization, as indeed are endemic in any civilization. As you know, there's been a lot in the newspapers about this issue because of the failure of our attempt to establish such a course with the Australian National University. And I don't want to rehearse all of the arguments that have been used. They may come up in question. That is fine. But the reality is that we have a very clear remit. Over the past few weeks, people have come up to me with all sorts of advice and have said, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Well, we have to do what the late Mr. Ramsay commissioned us to do. And we have a trust that we have to observe and honour, and we have to persevere with trying to establish a partnership. And at the moment, we are in discussion with Sydney University, and I am hopeful that that discussion will be fruitful. There is obviously opposition in university communities and in the community generally, and that's to be expected. I just want to say generally in relation to that opposition that the purpose of this is not to parade Western civilization in a triumphal sense, but also the purpose of it is not to go into the enterprise in an apologetic sense and being unwilling to extol and propound the virtues that Western civilization have clearly demonstrated over a very, very long period of time. And the simple proposition that unless a society fully understands where it has come from and fully understands the formative influences, and Peter mentioned the ones that most immediately spring to mind when one thinks about Western civilization, that one is, I think, unable to appreciate the character of the society in which we live. Now, where does this fit into the rather fragmented nature of modern politics? I, of course, as somebody who was a practitioner in Australian politics until a decade ago and at various stages had an influence on it, might be expected to say, well, of course, there was a time when things were done better. I don't do that. I think sometimes we lose sight, as with the passage of time, of just how volatile and turbulent politics was in the 1940s, 1950s and 1960s. We did have, for a combination of reasons, we did have a very long period of government under Menzies from 1949 to 1966, but it's sometimes forgotten that we had a fairly rapid succession of prime ministers after that. We had Holt, who of course tragically drowned, and then we had Gorton, who was removed, albeit after 3 years, by his own parliamentary party, effectively. And then we had the short period of Bill McMahon for 18 months. And we had the very turbulent Whitlam period. And we had, of course, 7 years of the Fraser government. But the point I make is that there have been quite a lot of turbulence. You look at British politics over the last 10 years, it's been turbulent. And that turbulence shows no signs of abating. The rigidity of the American presidential system relieves that system of that kind of turbulence, unless, of course, circumstances of impeachment arise, as they did with Richard Nixon. But nonetheless, American politics, because of the heavy division of power between the President and the Congress, has become far more partisan and far more bitterly entrenched as far as partisan turmoil is concerned than it was during the earlier years. And my general take is that, yes, politics in Australia has been very different and has had a lot of tumult. I think it has more to do with the internal mechanisms of the structures of our political parties now than perhaps other circumstances. I think one of the faults of modern Australian politics is that we have a diminishing number of people in the parliamentary parties who've had experience of life outside the rather strict political environment. I often amuse myself in reflecting upon the occupations of the final cabinet under Ben Chifley. It included, and I don't use the word amusing in any sarcastic sense, I think it's a salutary study. Chifley, of course, famously was an engine driver who'd become Prime Minister, and he also, of course, famously represented a large part of the area of New South Wales where we are at the present time. In his final cabinet, he had 2 farmers, he had a publican, he had a lawyer, he had a tobacconist. Now that's practically a criminal offence now. My point simply is that he was a person, and it was a party that I think represented a broader spectrum of life's experience. And I think we have, although I'm a great supporter of many of the people whose principal occupation before entering Parliament is to be a political staffer, and many of them have made and are making a great contribution, I think we are narrowing the gene pool far too much and it's happening on the Liberal Party side of politics. I'm not just having a go at my traditional political opponents. But I would conclude by expressing the view that modern politics is different from what it was 50 years ago, but the environment, the context, is profoundly different. 50 years ago, we were still, of course, living in the shadow of the Cold War. We're now living in a world in which the principal bilateral relationship and interaction around the world is that between the United States and China. And the influence of China and the rise of China and the impact of China on our own region, of course, very, very heavily defines what we do and how political parties behave. And whilst I don't suggest that the rise of China and the conflict between China and the United States is a neat replacement of the Cold War, it plainly isn't. I think we will lose sight of the context in which we operate our politics if we don't recognise that the change brought about by the end of the Cold War is still working its way through. It is creating a vacuum which is being filled by other issues, and it is in the context of that that I personally feel very strongly that the Ramsay remit is both important and will make, if it can be achieved, a valuable contribution to a better understanding of the environment in which our politics is conducted. Thank you.
Okay, well, the next part of the proceedings is we're having a couple of respondents, people who are going to comment on what Mr. Howard said, but also the issue more broadly. The first of these is, they're both members of our Blackheath Philosophy Forum organising committee, and the first of these is John Stephenson, who is a past chairman of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum. He's a local writer who's published a couple of excellent novels, and he's studied philosophy formally, but in the period since he studied, he's maintained contact with a network of people in the academic philosophy community. So, right, with that, he'll speak for roughly 5 minutes.
With a glass? Get a glass? Thanks. Get a glass, yeah. Your talk was very courageous, Prime Minister. Waiting a long time to say that. No, joke aside, we have to rejoice that we live in a society where an at times controversial former leader is willing to sit among us and take part in a frank discussion. It's deeply civilised and democratic, and thank you, Mr. Howard, for being here. There are three issues here. The first is the notion itself of Western civilization. What is it, and how can we talk satisfactorily about it? The second issue is the empirically establishable, factual reality of the character and conduct of Australian universities, in particular in what used to be called the liberal arts faculties. The third issue is the Ramsay Centre's curriculum and teaching conditions proposal in its pedagogical and equity ramifications. I'll try to be concise on these. It may take a little longer than 5 minutes. Firstly, sorry?
Not too much.
Firstly, Western civilization. I've observed that the Ramsay defenders flourish reverentially their Judeo-Christian heritage pennant alongside their home of political freedom and Enlightenment banner without any hint of how problematic and ironic all that is historically. There's a Jesuit priest called Andrew Hamilton writing in Eureka Street magazine on this, And he points out that when he was growing up in his Catholic community, the view going was that Western civilization reached its height about the late 13th century before starting downhill with a dubious thing called the Renaissance, then a catastrophic business called the Reformation, then that awful bloody Enlightenment, then those tricksters Darwin, Marx and Freud, and then where the narrative at last rejoins the secular conservatives, Satan's last fling at humanity, communism. In a new book on the topic of civilization, Professor Stephen Gaukrodger of Sydney University notes that in Pope Pius IX's 1864 Syllabus of Errors, error number 79 states, and I quote, "It is a ridiculous notion that the Pope can and must reconcile himself with progress, with liberalism, and with modern civilization." And why? Because what was coming to be synonymous with civilization by the middle 19th century was no longer culture and religion, but science and technology. That faith with the greatest number of adherents in the West, I was brought up in that faith, was dragged into modernity. And it's never had much truck with democracy. Still, speaking eloquently on the Ramsay Centre's aims, its director Simon Haynes lauds an undeniably great Western quartet of medical, scientific, political, legal, financial, economic, and cultural, intellectual achievement, an enriched knowledge of which he hopes his students will gain. Yet, whisper, whisper, that knowledge through their professional training regimes, medicine, law, business, engineering, science, architecture, teaching, as well as pure textual courses of study, is what our universities pursue already. But the word has gone out on the right that there are cadres of teachers in the arts and social science departments conspiring poisonously to turn their students against all this greatness. So we need the Ramsay Plan, a covert affirmative action program for hiring conservative scholars to combat them. In their pedigreeing of Western civilization, conservatives point to the Greece of glory and the Rome of grandeur, as well as the religious tradition. Remarkable as Greece and Rome were at an elite level, so productive of philosophy, literature, law, and government, they were also cruel and oppressive slave societies. Greece, in fact, was a Mediterranean crossroads culture rather than Western. The Jesuit Hamilton says a little more on the purported Westernness of our religious tradition. Not only does Christianity have ancient Judea as its place of origin, but crucial aspects of its character were shaped in holy schools in Syria, Egypt, and modern Turkey, and I might add modern Algeria for St. Augustine. It was only through the medieval Arab scholars that European Christendom rediscovered the philosophy of Aristotle, and through Aquinas applied it. The Arab-Muslim contribution to the culture and face of Spain was huge and magnificent. However, I sense that what Mr. Howard reveres as the heart of Western civilization is not its comforts bringing science and technology, and not even its art and music and religion and literature, because all old cultures have wonderful art and music and literature, but that political genius which flowered in Britain. And I personally would not be far away from you on that. That English political evolution of enshrined individual rights in the face of a king's authority, of the development of a parliament, of the rule of law, of the slow extension of the voting franchise to more and more of the citizens of the realm, the separation of powers, freedom of speech, assembly and publication, the growth of checks and balances against despotism and tyranny, the democratization of the polity, an ideal admired, disseminated, and imitated far beyond Britain, for many reasons in history. It is indeed sad and worrying at this time in history to see that ideal retreating or at bay around the world. The democratically refractory current governments of Hungary and Poland are styling themselves at the moment as defenders of Christian civilization, a mask for a manifestly racist and despicable anti-Muslim stance. Democracy has many current serious threats to it, but can we really believe that party to that threat are the arts and social science departments of Australian universities? I just need some water, Peter. Good, sorry. Yeah. In all the bile, anger, and venom thrown at the universities, particularly at one from the right-wing press and media in this episode, there really has been no hard evidence offered as a basis for it. There's certainly huge prejudice, a perception on the right that the arts and social science areas are peopled by left-wing fanatics working to make our students hate our own society. But what are the statistics of this conspiracy? What are the names of these traitors? What specifically and how many and in what proportion to the whole are the dangerous courses? Not a word on it. What kind of case in court is this? In this ideologically polarised time, we've just observed from the right-wing media a wave of profoundly uncivilised invective and paranoia. The principal rejection of the Ramsay proposal by the ANU on the utterly legitimate grounds that, as the offer conditions stood, its essential freedom and autonomy would be compromised, is interpreted as a result of agitation by nefarious unions and radicalised students. The word of the Nobel laureate Vice-Chancellor is doubted. Do we conclude that the choosing of principle over money is incomprehensible to the neoliberal mind? They won't take my millions, they must be left-wing. I'm not at a university myself, Peter's explained, but in the absence of evidence, all one can do is inquire. I've consulted half a dozen humanities academics on this, most of them distinguished professors emeriti of varying views in politics, who've insisted to me that there are many conservatives in the departments. And these departments in particular have suffered from the financial cuts wrought by recent governments and have shrunk in size, which does not help in the provision of maximum diversity of courses. Academics do not actively politicise, they just do their work. It's the politicians who love to politicise. The chief goal of a university liberal arts education is the development of a critical mind, a capacity to reason logically, to evaluate by argument and evidence whatever is presented to it. Courses in these subjects cannot be bland or simply adulatory of their material. They have to challenge, to offer variant narratives and perspectives. The teaching of history, for example, has developed in complex ways because we know so much more than we did even 50 years ago. For most of our civilization's history, learning was for an elite, male and either moneyed or monked. It is the democratization of learning and study in the past century which has allowed into the academy the new voices and testimony from the poor, from the common man and woman, especially from women, from the indigenous, from the colonized, from the homosexual. These voices have been heard in the universities because of the dynamism and the liberating, opening power of the forward movement of democracy. They are not a threat to it, they are the fruit of it. The third issue, I'll try to be brief, the Ramsay Centre's curriculum and teaching proposal. I've looked over the indicative curriculum, and I'm sure most seasoned readers and educationists would not want to object to the titles as such. The Centre concedes that many of the texts are already studied in different departments in our universities, but it wishes to integrate them differently. They're certainly among what has been handed down to us as great books of the past: philosophical, legal, historical, theological, dramatic, poetic, and literary, with some respected works of more modern commentary. It's a list one would be very happy to have read in entirety by the end of one's life. Larded in with them are what you might call musical and art appreciation courses of semester length. Still, apart from Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, there's no literary fiction at all from continental Europe written after Dante and Cervantes. There's a few 19th century and 20th century novels written in English, but no North American or Latin American literature at all. Nothing in the line of European existentialism, which is usually very palatable to young students. There's not a mention of the characteristic dramatic medium of the past century, taken as a normal element in critical work by modern young students: film. Much of the list is philosophical, broadly speaking, and having been myself a student of philosophy through to postgraduate, I have qualms. There's no work in the list of modern Anglo-American analytical philosophy, apart from Wittgenstein's Tractatus in the second year, a book which requires close guidance to unravel. There are different approaches to teaching philosophy, but as a modern discipline, it's very tough-minded and analytic, carried out in rigorous seminars and journal articles, very testing of logical and critical faculties. You might do a course or two in the history of philosophy over a degree. One method of learning might be to take a concept or theory from an ancient philosopher and see how it's travelled down through history by way of other philosophers. As in all subjects, analytical skills develop gradually over time as one knowledge deepens. Now, it's true, one of the Ramsay Centre directors, Elizabeth Stone, insists that they are alive to this need and want to see an incremental progression in sophistication of knowledge in the student over the course. I'm just not sure myself that an eclectic great books exposure, no matter how great the books are, is the best way to achieve that. You can't just read, for example, selections from the Bible in your first year without awareness of the astonishing number of textual, historical, and linguistic studies that have grown around the interpretations of it, especially in the last 2 centuries and especially in the last 50 years. You can't read Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in isolation from post-colonial and race relation studies. You can't read Jane Austen, and George Eliot in isolation from modern feminist studies. By the end of the 19th century, Marx, Darwin, and Freud had changed everything, even if no one today is an exact Marxian, an exact Darwinian, or an exact Freudian anymore. But we can't go back. They've just added concepts to our whole way of thinking and dealing with the universe around us. Arguably, almost finished, arguably, yes, well, too bad. Arguably, this is too important. Arguably, the most important book in the last 150 years, Darwin's Origin of Species, is missing from the Ramsay list. In short, there are pedagogical issues, possibly contentious, but they are just the sorts of things that our universities are best placed to resolve, not an outside body. The last thing, the Ramsay proposal envisages an elite core of students, scholarship fellows from their first year, meeting in admirably small classes and with an admirably small teacher-student ratio. How could this ever be incorporated into one of our public universities without a perception of inequity? Out on the main campus, your ordinary HECS-paying Jill and Joe student are soldiering away in large classes or getting some lectures online, fighting for space in the library, working 2 part-time jobs to cover the rent and food, while over there in the Ramsay building are these pampered Eloi, possibly in tweed jackets and loafers, having a bit of Immanuel Kant before morning tea, a bit of Aristotle in the afternoon before a cocktail. What is this, Bradley's Head Revisited? How does that represent, how could it represent our glorious democratic and egalitarian patrimony? Thank you.
Well, are we right? And now for something rather different. Our next contributor is a member of our organising committee, the Blackheath Philosophy Forum. His name's Ted Sadler. He's given a number of talks to this forum over the years. Indeed, he spoke at the inaugural series of talks of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum way back in 2002. Ted has undergone an interesting sort of ideological evolution. Back in the 70s and 80s, he was one of a circle of bright young Marxist philosophers around a character called Dr. Walt Suchting at Sydney University. And I think and Ted was on the academic staff and was part of that scene. Since then, he's taken a particular interest in German philosophy. Indeed, he's translated 3 volumes of the collected works of Martin Heidegger. And over that long period, his worldview has changed somewhat. And I think what he'll have to say will be somewhat different to what our last speaker had to say. So thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for Mr. Howard too for your very eloquent talk, and thank you, John Stephenson, for your contribution a few moments ago. I particularly thank John Stephenson because I could say that his talk is more or less a convenient summary of everything I don't believe. And if I had to characterise it, I would say that it is a beautiful example of modern and even postmodern Eurocentric arrogance and parochialism. I'd like to take, to try to illustrate that by comparing what he said about the Western tradition and about Christendom when he said, in greatly disparaging terms, that some Jesuits or some Catholic thinkers had referred to the 13th century as the heyday of Western civilization. And in rolling his eyes and in adopting a scornful gesture, he obviously expected this to receive a general assent. Now, in fact, in our present intellectual culture, there is general assent to that. There is general assent to the idea that the culture before the modern period, even before the very recent modern period, is something to be deplored as superstitious, unscientific, and bigoted, and that we in the modern period, through science and through certain political philosophies that have been taken on board in the last 100 or 200 years have moved way beyond where Western civilization was in the Middle Ages. Now, the reason I say that John Stephenson's, I only don't want to pick on John Stephenson, just because I think that his contribution is so relevant to this whole discussion, because it's so exemplary for the point of view that the Ramsay Centre is opposing and is pushing back on. If we compare this attitude with the attitude that would be taken in Islamic culture or in Hindu culture, and just think of the idea that an Islamic person would roll their eyes. A person from an Islamic culture would roll their eyes and adopt a scornful expression at the suggestion that the heyday of Islamic civilization was in the Middle Ages. Of course, that is absurd in Islamic civilization today, in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in every place where Islamic civilization dominates, they accept that the heyday of Islamic civilization was the Middle Ages, and that meaning in the centuries between about 900 and 1300. And I'd like to say the same thing about Hindu civilization. Who would expect a Hindu to roll their eyes and adopt a scornful posture at the thought that the heyday of Hindu civilization was either in the Middle Ages or indeed much farther removed in time, possibly back into the period of BC when the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita were written. We see a great difference in Islamic culture and Hindu culture. I'm just taking these as two examples, to the Western culture of today. In Islamic culture, they still read the classics of Islamic thought and of the Islamic faith, of course, including the Quran. And in Hindu culture, they still read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. The ordinary person in the street still reads them and still values them. And the idea that they should be scorned is absurd to people in these cultures. But our modern Western culture, our modernised Western culture since about the 17th or 16th century, takes a different view. We turn our backs in scorn at the past. My own personal view is, in fact, precisely the view that John Stephenson regarded as something laughable. The idea that the heyday of Christian culture was in the 13th century. I think it was. In my opinion, it was. That's not to say that culture can be recovered and replicated in the present day. So what has happened to create this situation? What has happened is that over the last 400 years or so, there has occurred in the West what has not happened in the East. What has not happened is in Islamic or Indian culture, and that is we have seen an abandonment of religion and a secularisation and a turn towards materialism. That is what has happened in the last 300 or 400 years. That is, society has moved towards the idea that its purpose is to create a hedonistic, materialistic system. This is something that has now taken over the West, so that the main issue in all Western societies now in politics is about the management, the materialistic and economic management of the society that exists, where next to no consideration is given of the value system, or indeed the religious system, of course, of our society. There has been an abandonment of religion, but not just of Christianity. Christianity is only really the smallest part of it. There has been an abandonment of the idea that there are standards, that there are absolute standards of morality, that truth can be absolute, that there is something which one can legitimately call the spiritual realm of reality, that not all reality can be summed up in material, utilitarian and hedonistic terms. All of that is now lacking in our modern culture. One way I could describe this is to say that in this modern period, we are facing a culture of relativism, a culture which does not believe in standards. Only in this last period of 50 years or so has this relativism of modern materialistic, hedonistic culture come to be called multiculturalism. Multiculturalism as a way of avoiding the question of what culture is. Multiculturalism as the culture that one has when one doesn't have a culture. Multiculturalism as the culture which says nothing about one's culture, except that it is not this, that, or something else. It is always something all-inclusive and yet nothing in particular. This is the culture that we have, the culture that cannot define itself, the culture that has no unity, the culture does not believe in a spiritual principle of unity, the culture that does not believe in spiritual reality, the culture that does not believe in religion, the culture that does not believe in absolute standards, the culture which has turned its back on its Christian heritage, the culture which has turned its back on its Greco-Roman humanistic heritage. The culture is given over to the pursuit of what Francis Bacon called, in a famous work published in the early 1600s, the relief of man's estate. The relief of man's estate, meaning the provision of the material conditions of human existence in the most efficient way possible. This is what has been in place in the last 400 years, but to an accelerated degree, until in the modern day, there is nothing except this. The Prime Minister of this country, Malcolm Turnbull, speaks about nothing except that. Nothing. And nor does the Leader of the Opposition speak about anything except that. But this is it's a question, I'm sure, with Mr. Ramsey, about how long our culture can continue to go along that path, turning its back on the values of the past, continuing to believe that there are no material values, nothing else except material values, continuing to insist on the primacy above all of utilitarian values, how long it can continue, and to what extent we can continue eradicating the remnants of the past and of the tradition that are still with us, because there are remnants. Christianity has still some influence today. Greco-Roman humanism still has some influence today. I know every time there is a census, it reveals that, well, only now 51% of people call themselves Christian. And the ABC come out full of celebration, as it were. Oh, it's down to 51% now. It's down to 51%. It'll soon be down to 40% and down to 30 and 20, and it'll fade away. Eventually it'll fade away. And the memory of Greco-Roman humanism, that'll fade away too. The classics of culture which were taught way back in the days of Greco-Roman times, that were revered, that were passed down from generation to generation, that the John Stephenson turns his nose up at. And acts and adopts a superior posture towards. These still have some influence. They are still valued by some people. But then there are people today, and they're in the universities, especially, that want to get rid of even the remnants. And I believe this is what the Ramsey matter is all about. Are we going to continue along a path which eradicates every last remnant of the traditional heritage of our Western civilization, meeting precisely the Christian and the Greco-Roman humanistic heritage, the heritage which believed in absolute values and standards? Are we going to continue along the path to eradicate that so that we have nothing left and we live in what one American political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, has called a universal and homogeneous state which resembles nothing more closely than George Orwell's 1984? Are we going to move further along to that, or is there going to be some resistance? The same questions have arisen through modernisation in Islamic and Hindu countries. There's been a pushback in Islamic countries against modernisation and the desire to maintain traditional religious values in those countries. The same thing has happened in India with respect to Hinduism. And they've done it much more successfully than we have. Here we have laid down and allowed the juggernaut of modern materialism and hedonism to walk all over our traditional culture in a way that the Islamic and Hindu cultures have not allowed. That is why I call John Stephenson's contribution Eurocentric, parochial and arrogant, because it takes up a position according to which we modern, secular, materialistic and scientifically educated people are supposed to be infinitely wiser and more knowledgeable than everybody else in the world that has ever lived in all the cultures of the world. This is his proposition. This is the proposition he wants you to accept. This is the proposition. This is the proposition that is being pushed back against by the Ramsay Foundation. Thank you.
My name is Isabel Lee. I want to thank the four gentlemen in front who have chaired the session. Peter has chaired the session, and I want to thank the three speakers. I want to particularly thank Mr. John Howard, because I'm the treasurer for Blackheath Philosophy Forum. So I am thrilled.
Thank you.
I want to say that maybe the definition of Western civilization is slightly problematic at the moment, because I want to talk about literature, art, and music. If you talk about literature, I would say, because I come from China, I have a best example given from China. Mo Yan, who has won the Nobel Prize, said that he was influenced by Faulkner. And Borges, an Argentinian writer, has influenced so many Chinese writers that in Guangzhou, a bookshop is named by his name. And talk about music. When you think of music, you think of Lang Lang for piano. You think of Ma Yoyo for cello. And I have to say that Jen and I go to a dance, a ballet class at Simon Theatre, and half of the class are Chinese. So I want to propose that Western civilization is not owned by people from the West. It's part of our shared humanity and our human heritage. And it's... And like many things, when it has own vitality, it's vibrant everywhere, and it might well has its disciples elsewhere in the world that you don't see. In a radio interview, I have nominated Leonard Cohen as one of my elders. That's my proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. No, look, I totally agree with her. No, I just totally agree with her. Absolutely.
Thank you. I've never come to one of these before, so this is actually really good to see and good to hear, and I enjoy listening to everyone's opinions. I'm not familiar with anyone on the board there except for Mr. Howard. So just a question in regards to, I think yourself, sir, brought up the multiculturalism having an impact or some sort of sway on Western civilization. And I just want to open it up, your opinions on immigration from non-Western countries that have, do you think that it will have an impact on Western societies, Western values, the democratic way of process, I suppose, if you think that's going to have an impact on Western civilization, this immigration? Thank you.
Well, can I just say that I am on record as having reservations about the philosophy of multiculturalism, but my view about immigration is that we should have a non-discriminatory immigration policy. We should draw people from different parts of the world, as we do, but we should be very keen that people who come to our country, in a generic sense, unite us behind a common set of values. One of the most penetrating books I've ever read on this was written by somebody on the liberal left in the United States, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was President Kennedy's principal advisor and speechwriter. He wrote a book in 1991 called The Disuniting of the United States, and it actually foretold some of the difficulties of what I might call a more zealous multicultural approach. I think what the treasurer, the happy treasurer, said a few moments ago really drove home my point more eloquently than I could, that Western civilization is not the exclusive possession of people of European or Western or Anglo-Celtic background. It's a civilization that's available to everybody, and that really underpins my approach to immigration.
Yes.
Hi, Kirsten Black. I just wanted to give my defence of the Great Books program, which the Ramsay Institute would put in place if it goes ahead. Hopefully it does. I completed my undergraduate at ANU in 2005 and understood that everything was a structure with, and politics could be understood as different kind of power structures. And I had to go to America to have a second education, to complete a Great Books education, knowing that how inadequate my first education had been. And it's very sad that Australia couldn't offer some sort of similar program, and that I had to go to America. I'm really hoping that the Ramsay Institute is able to give that sort of correction to the Australian education system, which, because I'm working at ANU at the moment as an educational designer, and I can say that the situation at universities now is even worse, and that I'd be very happy to see the kind of correction that the curriculum would bring about.
Okay, that's a comment rather than a question.
Yep.
Okay, I've got a question. Anyone can answer from the panel if they'd like. I'm curious to know if the Ramsay Centre or the Ramsay Pseudo-University, is that what it's going to be? Is it going to have on the curriculum some look at the last couple of 300-400 years of this civilization and go, what are the 10 biggest mistakes that we've made? And are they going to be part of the curriculum?
Who?
Is the Ramsay Institute going to have part of the curriculum? What are our 10 biggest mistakes in Western civilisation?
Well, my reaction to that is that it would rather predetermine the outcome. To nominate the 10 biggest mistakes of Western civilisation. If we believe in academic freedom and proper academic inquiries, and that's something that ought to emerge in the study of a BA on Western civilisation rather than the Ramsay Centre or anybody else saying in advance, and if I'm hearing your question correctly, saying in advance these are the 10 biggest mistakes. Of course Western civilisation has made mistakes. Of course it has, and the whole purpose of a proper study of it would be for those mistakes and the study of them to emerge alongside an understanding of the enormous benefits that it has contributed to the shaping of our modern society. I mean, that's fundamental, surely.
What would be your biggest mistake?
Yeah. Oh, look, you know, the biggest mistake I made in politics was allow the Pakistani army into talking me to bowl on the mountains of Kashmir.
Thank you, Mr. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Howard. Well, my question is regarding the current work you're doing with the Ramsay Centre to get involved with Sydney University. I was watching ABC's Q&A about 2 weeks back, and I think it was the President or the Vice President who was on the show.
The Vice-Chancellor.
Yeah, sorry, Vice-Chancellor. And they quizzed him about the issues with the ANU in regards to academic freedom. And what he said on the show, he said you'd be more than happy to have the Ramsay Centre's Western civilisation, but not at the expense of academic freedom. I noticed that in your talk you were mentioning there are certain things you can't sway from due to you have to honour what Paul Ramsay wanted out of the degree. Is there any wriggle room there? Is there a way you can pull back on some of these policies to help get this through?
Well, there's nothing in Paul Ramsay's remit that disputed academic freedom. I mean, look, just so, I mean, I know there are different views on this in the room, and I respect that, but the reality is that in relation to the ANU, we had reached a point where agreement had been concluded between the people on behalf of the centre and the nominated negotiators, if you like, on behalf of the ANU, both about a process concerning staff, where there was a majority held by the ANU, and also the content of the curriculum, both of which were subject to final decision by the academic board of the university. And we had reached that point. But then there was internal resistance. And that's life, that's democracy. But there's nothing in our approach which confronts academic freedom. I accept academic freedom. I mean, we're asking for a partnership with one of the great universities to have an aggregate, holistic course in Western civilisation. Now, the question of whether Western civilisation should be condemned, applauded, lionised, whatever, that's all part of the process. But for heaven's sake, can't we at least accept the desirability of an aggregated, holistic study of Western civilisation?
Thank you.
Peter?
I must say that I regret that this Ramsay money exists. I regret the fact that so much discussion is about where the Ramsay money is going to be directed. The more important point to me is the nature of Western civilisation and our attitudes towards it. But if I have to express a point of view about where the Ramsay money should or should not be directed, I certainly would agree with the point of view expressed by Greg Sheridan about a month ago in The Australian, where he said that it certainly should not go to any of the universities. The reason is that nothing can be expected from the universities other than obstruction and hostility to the program. I worked in universities for... I was in the universities for 35 years as a student and member of staff, and I can say, well, I would estimate about 90% at least of the academic staff in the so-called liberal arts and social sciences or humanities are left-wing detesters and scorners of Western civilization in the mould that we have seen John Stephenson express a little bit earlier today. Therefore, I think it is like giving money to the enemies of Western civilization if it goes into the universities. But it's up to Mr. Howard and his colleagues to decide that. I really don't think that's the interesting question. I think the interesting question is about the nature of Western civilization. And I'd just like, getting back to a point that was made by one of the questioners, is it relevant only for Westerners? Of course not for Westerners. Of course not only for Westerners. Every great civilization has the ability to be appropriated to and appreciated by everybody else in the entire world, including those from the other great civilizations. I've been around the art galleries and museums of Europe, and I've seen how many people from different countries in the world, from the east, from the north, from the south, from everywhere, attend the museums and art galleries of Europe in order to at least be exposed to that type of cultural experience, which is largely a Western cultural experience, of course. Of course, it is available to people of every type. But it's really an attitude... I beg your pardon?
I said there's 2 minutes applied to the respondents.
Not normally, but I think please, Mike.
I've now finished.
No, I'm not going to talk long. Look, shall I ask you, how many of you concluded that I had contempt for Western civilization? About 20%. The noes have it. The Jesuit was making the joke. He was the one making fun. I reported his joke. My idea is that it should be much broader, that they should be teaching Western civilization along with all civilizations, endow a chair for it.
They do.
And I'm sure Western civilization will hold up in that comparative study. If you have confidence in your culture, let it be studied next to others. They'll all come back to respecting it.
Hi. My 2 comments bear on the scope and content of the Ramsey Center program. I immigrated here from the Middle East, that's my first comment, and I was very surprised that literature is called here English. I always find it quite curious that it's called English, as if it's just a means to an end for improving English or something. I wasn't sure. I was also surprised that, like Mr. Stephenson said, there are not many texts, even within Europe, being translated even into English from Russian literatures and Polish literature and others. So that's my first comment. My second comment is to do with the fact that in the 1960s, there was a school called the Birmingham Schools, and that's where cultural studies as a discipline in university started, basically. There were, I think, Stuart Hall was one of the most famous persons there. And my question or suggestion, perhaps, is why not combine this existing discipline for the last 50 or 60 years of cultural studies, marry it with the contents that are being studied, and that way maybe get to a kind of a compromise between approaches here that we've heard.
Can I just make again very briefly the point that the Ramsay Centre is bound by the terms of the bequest. I mean, I've had a lot of people saying to me, you should do this, you should do that. There are certain things that have been suggested to me, if I did them, they'd be a breach of trust. And my obligation and the obligation of the other members of the board is to pursue the remit that was given to us by Paul Ramsay. Now, if at the end of that process we can't achieve a partnership with the Sandstone University, and it's salutary to me that the resistance to this proposal validates the decision made by Paul Ramsay to commit this money. Now, I've heard about the Greg Sheridan view. I have a lot of regard for Greg Sheridan. He's a great writer, and I agree with a lot of things he says, but not all of them. And I am very much of the view that those who want to have a holistic study of Western civilization should understand that our responsibility is to do what the person who left this money wanted us to do, and to try and establish a partnership with the Sandstone University to study it. Now, if that doesn't prove to be possible, I think that will be a great pity, but I just ask you in a spirit of goodwill, because there are a lot of people here who are obviously sympathetic to what Paul Ramsay wanted, to understand that our obligation, certainly in the near term, is to see if we can establish a partnership, and we'll talk in a respectful, sensible fashion with Sydney University, and indeed perhaps others as well. Now, if that all comes to nothing, and that will be a shame, then we have to really go back to the original text, that is the text of the bequest, and see what the alternative course of action is. But I am interested that this proposal has stimulated so much resistance in certain academic circles, and it does seem to me to indicate that Paul Ramsay was on the money when he left the money.
If they won't take my money, they must be left-wing. That's what he's saying.
Oh, come on. Come on, mate.
Richard Stiles, just a comment. Thank you, Mr. Howard, for coming to speak to us and offering us the chance to speak from the floor. I'd offer that one of the challenges of a pluralist democracy is to engage in the complex and nuanced dialogue between celebrating the culture of the dominant socio-cultural group and how it interfaces with the minority groups. And that I agree that should be on the basis of requesting a mutually respectful dialogue. My concern is that the view that you have expressed around Anglo-Saxon culture was used during your time in politics and as Prime Minister in a very divisive way that fanned racism, religious intolerance and xenophobia, and that you use those things as political tools to secure power, perhaps more than any Prime Minister in modern Australian history. And so I would contend that that legacy is something that is far from what I and probably a number of people in this group are proud of, and that your role in these bodies, because of that heritage that you have publicly advocated for many years, does come with many concerns.
I'll regard that as a comment.
Maggie McKenzie, this is my first forum, pretty exciting, and you were the draw card. The second speaker, I could resonate a lot with your sense of loss of what appears to be the role of religion, a sense of spirituality in our society. And I think the huge elephant in the room, because the scope of our topic possibly doesn't go there, but the huge elephant in the room is the role of capitalism and turning citizens into customers. And the great quote of Margaret Thatcher when she was rising to her sense of course she wanted to kickstart Britain, but she said there is no such thing as society. And so I think we need to acknowledge the role of the delusion of trickle-down economics as though that's going to reach everybody. And that's one side of whether it's Western culture, but in the dehumanising for the many, many, many people who are not able to equally access the same services and goods. So that's number one comment, is that's the elephant in the room. Second one, I'll be really quick, is my sense of multiculturalism is pluralistic respect. As a white Anglo from Scotland who went to Sydney Uni, I never realised that when I did my master's degree 10 years ago, I was what would be called a skippy. I thought my white was enough. Realised others saw me as Australian skippy.
Look, 2 minutes. There you see, I actually enforced the time limit.
Comment.
My name's Rosemary Albert. Thank you, Mr. Howard, and the two respondents. My great concern at the moment, I think, is freedom, the future of freedom in Australia and the Western world, as well as across the rest of the world, and the role of Western civilization in bringing about the level of freedom that we've known, and the intersection of that with politics and how politics, because you've spoken as a politician, Mr. Howard, what is happening in our country and in the Western world, where in Western civilization did the idea of the value of each individual human being come from? The idea of a right simply by, because I am human, then I have certain rights that cannot be denied, whatever my status may be, my intelligence, my usefulness. Where did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights come from in Western civilization? The valuing of each human life. Where did Hitler come from in Western civilization? Where are we going now? And is that related to losing the sense of the value of each human life? And how does that play out in whether we understand where we've come from in our study of Western civilization? I would love to see. I would love to do the course.
Thank you. Any respondent?
Well, a very brief comment. Not everybody who shares my views about Western civilization will necessarily share this view, but my own personal view is that the sanctity of the individual can first be found in the Christian view of that every individual had a personal relationship with God, whereas the older view of different societies with different religious beliefs was that one's religion as well as one's proprietary rights in society were determined by some kind of paterfamilias or some kind of overarching philosophy that directed what your place was. Now, as I say, not everybody would share that view, but if you want my own personal view, that is where the origin of all of these things in Western civilization can be found.
My name's Jeff Gordon. I'd just like to say that I support the idea of going back and finding what our roots are in Western civilization. But my problem is, where do you draw the boundary line around Western civilization? If you go back far enough, Western civilization has its roots in the Islamic civilization and in China. For instance, where would we be if we were still calculating with Roman numerals instead of Arabic numerals? We'd be in a pretty pickle, you know. And a whole lot of advances during the height of the Islamic civilization, the Moors in Spain and so on. They developed a lot of science which was used in Western civilization and a lot of medicine. They were still using textbooks from that period 500 years later in Western universities, medical textbooks. If you look at our common vocabulary, numbers like 0, that's an Arabic word, azimuth, we've got zenith, nadir, all of these terms that are used in astronomy and navigation, alchemy, alcohol, they were introduced into Europe by the Arabs. Coffee, as well as alcohol, comes from the Arabics. The game of chess came via the Arabs. The whole lot of things that...
I think we get the general point.
Yeah. So I mean, when you go back into the roots of Western civilization, does the Ramsay program propose giving full credit to the roots of Western civilization in the Islamic world? Paper from China, gunpowder from China, all that sort of thing. Really, we have a world civilization. Why not just have a study of civilization and include the whole lot?
Comments? Yeah, sorry. Did you want
to? Just to correct that historical comment, I'm sure that a lot of people here are aware that Muhammad was born about 570 and died about 630. And so it is rather a stretch to say that Western civilization is dependent on Islamic civilization. But it's not a competition about which civilization is best. It's not a competition. This is not about preferring or privileging one civilization over another. I should also point out that in the heyday, in the great age of Islamic civilization, of course, everyone knows that the Arabs took over the Levant and the Mesopotamian area, which had previously been Greek, and then adopted and made their own the tradition of Greek philosophy. This was a period in which Western Europe was in the Dark Ages, and it's true, as people have already said, I think John Stephenson mentioned, that Western Europe, in coming out of the Dark Ages, gained a lot from Arabic and Islamic civilization at that time, but that was because Arabic Islamic civilization had at that time appropriated Greek civilization and taught Greek philosophy back to the West. So let us not be misled by that previous speaker's historical remarks. But above all, let us be aware that this is not a competition between civilizations, and it's not a matter of being resentful on the part of one civilization towards another.
Yes, I'd like to ask, are you aware, John Howard and others, that the English courses or the literature courses in state high schools have been trashed by the postmodernists? They have been, for example, I'll give you an example, that Che Guevara's book, The Motorcycle Diaries, which is a translation of a Spanish text of a mediocre travelogue, but because it's done by a left-wing communist, is a central piece to the English syllabus in New South Wales, in the area of discovery for Year 12. Another alternative is a series of television pieces, Get Back to Where You Belong, that bit that criticises your policy on border protection, that tries to undermine any faith the students may have in that. So I get that idea, but going to the universities themselves, they are rubbish heaps of postmodernism in the areas of literature. And that comes from Professor Barry Spur, who was sacked unceremoniously. Now, I support very strongly the Ramsay Centre because it would get literature teaching back on the rails, that you would actually teach great texts of the Western world in the way they should be taught as masterpieces, and would avoid all this related material and neo-Marxist claptrap that's confused everything. That's what I would like to see happen, and I'd particularly like to see it come into the schools, and I'd particularly like to see delinquent Liberal governments, like the one we've got in New South Wales, do something about that syllabus.
Well, I obviously don't accept we have a delinquent government in New South Wales, but beyond that, I am aware, Peter, of those things. I, in fact, some years ago complained very strongly in a speech I gave in Perth about the national curriculum and the idea that everything had to be taught in the context of three things: engagement with Asia, nothing wrong with that. We're practicing it very successfully, the environment and Indigenous affairs, and how you can relate everything that is studied at school against those three things defies, in my view, proper intellectual judgment. And I regret to say that I don't think a lot has been done to improve the school curriculum, and I didn't use the language you use, I just didn't want to be provocative.
Can I say something? As a matter of fact, at the moment, there's a very big Australian Research Council grant funding a very big research project by there's a Teachers of English Language Association with good academics and school teachers in it, and they're funding a big research program on determining the real literary content of the Australian syllabuses. So that's actually, something to thank the federal government for, and it's a move in the direction of let's get literature back. I'm totally in sympathy with both Peter Crawford and the young woman who did the course in America. I spent my life teaching English. It's my great love. I slaved over 2 very well-received novels, and I would love to see, or I actually would love to see this come back to the universities, but the point is, why can't people accept the ANU statement on what happened there? The Ramsay Centre wanted a micromanaging control over the curriculum, the teachers, there would be vetoes, etc., and it was just not possible to incorporate it into it. If I know you've, Mr. Howard, you've said you can't change the bequest, but I just wish some more thinking would be done on how this could be made to work. I am wishing to be constructive about it. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
I've worked in universities for 25 years, so I can tell you why the ANU bid failed, and people forward me emails all the time with respect to campaigns to try and sabotage the Ramsay Centre getting up at Sydney. So the idea that, that there is absolutely no politics going on institutionally is just ridiculous. I'm sorry, but it's just ridiculous. Okay, what I wanted to say though is that the conversation has really focused on what I would call the supply side of higher education, which is, what should a good humanities program look like? Having taught in the humanities and social sciences, I've been struck at just how quickly things have changed on the demand side, I think, in terms of what you can expect from students, what they'll read, whether or not they come to class, but also what kind of subjects they take. And, they used to take literature, and then they started taking, film and television, and then they started taking communication studies, and now I suspect they're taking event management because they want to go and work for David Walsh and the Dark Mofo Festival in Tasmania. It's whatever's sexy at the time. So I'm just wondering how the Ramsay Centre is thinking about negotiating things on the demand side. And I know you're resistant to alternative models, but I will put one forward. The University of Winchester, which is a very small, originally Anglican, it was founded on an Anglican mission, has recently instituted something called the Institute for Value Studies, and it expects every undergraduate across the university, whether you're doing engineering or whatever you're doing, to take at least one or two of their subjects. And in the Institute for Value Studies, you have to ask yourself the big questions. Now, all I'm saying is that asking yourself the big questions is perhaps a little less controversial than being asked to think about Western civilization.
Thank you.
Comment?
No, it's good.
So these will be the last two questions.
Hi, my name is Michel Streich. I'm from Europe and I'm very much in favor of classical humanist education. However, I find, especially looking at Europe, it's very hard now to look at the principle of, or the concept of Western civilization apart from the perceived threat from Muslim culture. This is what a lot of right-wing parties in Europe are currently obviously spruiking. Getting back to Western civilization, if you move beyond what we talked about, Judeo-Christian culture and the Greco-Roman culture, if you actually go back to the origins of Western civilization, you get to the cultures of Sumeria, Assyria, Babylon. Ultimately modern-day Iraq. When we look at what's currently happening in Iraq and how during the Iraq War, culture, the cradle of a culture was destroyed. After the Iraq War, cultural artifacts were looted, stolen, destroyed. How the Iraq War has led to the rise of ISIS and the destruction of another cradle of our culture, Syria. I was just wondering if the three speakers could maybe briefly talk about this point, how there is possibly, if you advocate Western culture in that context of supporting the Iraq War staunchly, how that can be reconciled, or if there's some sort of cognitive dissonance, or if there's some sort of feeling of guilt or regret. I would like to hear about that.
Well, I think that's questions directed at me, isn't it?
Yeah, mostly.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I mean,
okay.
Maybe
I get the message. Look, I'm not sure that the meeting wants to have a lengthy discussion about the Iraq War. I'm happy to stay for a couple of hours and do so if you want to, because I think we'd sort of take that and reach no final conclusions. Of course, if you have a proper study of Western civilization, you have to study it in all its aspects, and that obviously includes, along the way, I guess, an examination of conflicts in which Western countries have been involved. Of course it includes that. I mean, a lot of people have talked about where does Western civilization start and finish. Well, there's no simple answer to that. We all have our intuitions, we all have our beliefs about that. But the fact that there is an acceptance in all of the contributions, although they vary, there's an acceptance that there is such a thing as Western civilization. There's an acceptance that it does have a Greco-Roman content, the Judeo-Christian content, the Enlightenment, and I do agree with Mr. Stephenson that I think one of the great contributions to Western civilization have been the civilizing English political institutions. I'm long on the record as saying that I don't believe in a Bill of Rights. I think you only need three things for a democratic society. You need a robust parliamentary system, you need an incorruptible judiciary, and you have a free and sceptical press. If you have those three things, I think all the Bill of Rights in the world are unnecessary, and those three things owe very much their origins, not totally, but very much their origins to the English democratic tradition. So, of course, you have to examine properly all definitions of Western civilization, but if you're going to have a course, there's got to be some agreement. And can I just say again, in defence of the Ramsay position in relation to the ANU, there had been an agreement on the curriculum. There'd been an agreement reached according to the negotiating parameters on the staff selection process. In neither case was academic freedom denied. In neither case was the power of the academic board denied. The truth is that there was rebellion in the ranks and the ANU decided to pull out.
Last question.
Yes, my name is Peter Bonchar. I've been to about 10 or so philosophy forums in the last 3 years, and what I find is just about every speaker comes from the same angle, same direction. It's a sort of a leftist slant, and what they're looking for is say, a socialist government's going to solve their problem, or science is going to solve people's problem, and we're going to have a better civilization that way. What I find is that something is missing in a lot of people's lives, and that's some sort of spiritual void in their lives. And if you give them a better government, maybe more money, more handouts, more this, there's still that spiritual void that's not going to be solved by a political or scientific proper solution. So what I'm saying is, does anyone offer any spiritual solution to the fact that, okay, we're the richest society, we've got all this material goods, we've got all this pleasure, all this hedonistic, but we're still not happy. And I mean, if you're at the Carrington, Hugh Mackay was basically giving a lecture about, you know, we're not a happy society, we need more compassion. So I'm saying, take the politics away, take the science away, what is left to give us some kind of genuine meaning to life from anyone?
Okay, any comments? We're not going to solve the meaning of life in the last 2 minutes. Oh, John Stephenson is.
Look, I always, when this kind of thing comes up, I just think, well, what can we do? You know, where can we go? If you have come to a sincere, clear belief that, that was God. It was God saying, don't speak anymore here. If you know, I sincerely cannot believe in any religious, you know, interpretation of life, what do you do? Where do you go, you know? Well, people put their lives into creative work, into their families, you know, into whatever love can be for them in life. Children, grandchildren, in my case, is a great love. Where can we go and what can we do? I mean, there's all the great art to enjoy, despite what this character says. I've probably spent more time in world art galleries than he ever has. Music, you know, great music, wonderful music. You just do your best, you know. Where, I put it to you, where can we go?
Just my final comment. Where can we go? Well, I don't think there is anywhere that modern secularist materialism can go, except to further along the track that it is presently proceeding, that is, into the further intensification of identity politics and the politics of hysteria, which now dominates the left. That's where you can go. Now, John Stephenson says he can't relate to religious ideas, and there are some people that can't relate to secularist ideas. Somehow that conflict has to be overcome in a future society. But perhaps we might learn from Islamic society. Now, I, as much as anybody, or more than anybody, detest and deplore Islamic terrorism and the jihadism of the Islamists. But I recognise in Islamic society they take spirituality and religion seriously. Now, many people on the left profess to admire the Muslims and certainly ally themselves with the Muslims politically. I suggest that they might think about allying themselves with the Muslim attitude towards spirituality and religion, and to try to transplant that approach into the modern society in the West. The Muslims take it seriously, the Hindus take it seriously, they introduce into their institutions and their education spiritual content. We don't. Why don't we take a leaf out of their book?
Okay, well that concludes the session. I have to say we've seriously disappointed Mr. Howard today in one key respect. I'm told reliably by a very close relative of Mr. Howard that he really enjoys a good demonstration against him. No event is complete. And it looked like we'd have one. There was a bit of chatter on social media, but unfortunately it didn't materialise. So, we thought we'd try and orchestrate something, but we didn't get around to it. But I wanted to show your appreciation to Mr. Howard and the two respondents.